So in this brief tutorial, we're going to take a look at two kinds of introductions. The general to specific introduction, which you probably took a look at in grade 9 and grade 10. And we'll take a quick look at what are called anecdotal introductions. Okay, so let's begin with general to specific. General to specific introductions work on this basic premise. You have your thesis, which is going to be the last sentence in your introduction, and you begin with your introduction with a general statement about that topic. And the goal is to narrow the discussion of that topic in such a way that it leads naturally to the discussion of the thesis. Now I'm going to show you two examples of this really quickly, just because I believe at this point you've taken a look at these forms before. So while I don't have complete paragraphs written for you, I do have a basic framework that I think will help you remember how this works. So we have two examples here. In both cases, we have a thesis and we have a potential beginning and the narrowing of the topic. Now, it's important to note that there are many potential beginnings. As long as you start a general to specific introduction with some kind of appropriate connection to one of the topics in the thesis statement, then this will probably work out for you. So let's take a look at what I have here. So let's imagine that my thesis is about George Bush, and my thesis is that despite his initial promise, George Bush did not live up to the expectations of the American people. Now, there are a lot of ways I can begin this. I could talk perhaps or write about the potential beginning, something to do with George Bush himself. Could be something to do with the American people. In this example, however, I've chosen to begin with the topic of the presidency. This allows me to prepare the reader for that eventual discussion of George Bush. It also leads effectively into the narrowing of that topic down to perhaps what American voters want from a president. Now, it's important to note here too that with these examples, clearly I need to add more connecting sentences. I need to create a sense of flow that moves the reader from that discussion of the presidency to what American voters want from a president, and eventually to George Bush. Okay, so let's take a quick look at another example to show you how this can work. So imagine that this next bit of writing is very much like a movie review. We'll start with a thesis, which is, while Toy Story 3 features the same lovable characters as the first two films, the story fails to capture the hearts of the viewers. Okay, so what I need are some sentences that will prepare the reader in some way for this thesis. So because I'm using a general to specific approach, I want to choose a subtopic, a topic in this thesis and start discussing that quite broadly. So again, there are a number of possibilities. We could start with something to do with characters that are part of our popular culture. We can talk about perhaps Toy Story, the series. I've chosen to focus on animated films and how they have become mainstream. This leads quite naturally into why animated films are so popular with film studios, perhaps because it's easier to produce sequels because the characters already exist, right? Which I think works quite well in this context because my thesis is essentially arguing that for some reason this particular sequel is not as effective as the versions that came before it. Okay, so again, that's just a quick overview of a general to specific introduction. Because I think you're somewhat familiar with this already, we're going to move on to our next kind of introduction. An anecdotal introduction is actually quite simple if you can sustain it. An anecdote is simply a story that we tell because it's interesting, and you've heard lots of these stories before, whether it's your teacher, your friend. Anytime someone tells you a story just because it's interesting and seems relevant in some way, that's an anecdote. An anecdotal introduction takes advantage of that, and what it attempts to do is to prepare the reader for the thesis by telling a story that's relevant to that thesis. So there are two important differences, I think, between a general to specific introduction and an anecdotal introduction. And it's these 2 points right here. Let's take this one first. Because we don't need to move from general to specific, the thesis in an anecdotal introduction doesn't have to be that last sentence, right? If you think about that funnel approach we use with general to specific, it leads to the thesis. You don't need to have that with the anecdotal introduction. And in fact, there are numerous examples online that you can find of anecdotal introductions where the thesis is the first, second, third sentence in the story. It just depends how you create and mold that story. The other important rule I want you to keep in mind is that that anecdote, that story you create or tell the reader, must take up the entire length of the introduction. This means that you can't simply tell that anecdote in 2 sentences and then move into a general to specific introduction for the rest of it. You have to sustain that introduction for the length of the piece. So let's take a look at what this could look, what this might look like. Let's imagine that I am actually writing my own taxonomy, and since you're working on taxonomy now, this might make sense to you. And that taxonomy or that classification I'm working with has to do with video games and learning. So I have created categories for games that I think will help me discuss video games and learning in an effective way. So here are my categories. We'll go over them really quickly just so you have some context for the anecdotal introduction I'm about to show you. So my categories are, my classes are open world games, puzzle games, skill-based games, games where you constantly learn new methods of gameplay. And then my last category will be simulation strategy games. Now, it's important to note in my anecdotal introduction, while my thesis certainly needs to connect to these, it's not like I have to use that route map kind of style to write this introduction. I'm going to be using a story that prepares the reader for the thesis, which in turn prepares the reader for a discussion of these ideas. So let's take a quick look at what I've got here. Now this is a long one. You can find it on my blog, so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. But what I will show you is this really, really long anecdote prepares the reader for this thesis right here. Now, it just so happens that my thesis happens to be the last sentence of the introduction. Remember, it doesn't have to be there. It could be at the beginning, it could be in the middle, as long as the reader can clearly identify it, and as long as the body of your essay connects to this, you're fine, right? So what I'd like you to do is take a look at my blog, see this introduction in its entirety, so you can see how that story is sustained, and you can see how, hopefully, how this anecdote connects very clearly to my thesis, and thus is a good example of an anecdotal introduction.